The Haunted Dolls of Briarwood. Chapter 1, The Call Home. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of day when the sky seemed to be weeping along with the earth. Clara had been going through her usual routine, pouring coffee, checking her emails, and trying to shake off the lingering fog of another sleepless night, when her phone rang. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat, Mom. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. It had been months since they last spoke, and their conversations were rarely pleasant. But something in the pit of her stomach told her that this was not a call she could ignore. Hello. Clara's voice sounded foreign to her ears, strained and uncertain. Clara, it's your grandmother. She's passed away. Her mother's voice was flat, devoid of the warmth Clara remembered from her childhood. The words hung in the air like a heavy mist, thick and suffocating. Clara's mind raced, memories of her grandmother's house flooding back to her, the creaking floors, the smell of old books, the dolls. She hadn't seen her grandmother in years, not since their relationship had soured, but the news still struck her like a physical blow. I'm sorry, her mother continued, not waiting for Clara to respond. I know you two weren't close anymore, but, well, there's the matter of the house. You were her only grandchild, and she left everything to you. The estate needs to be settled. Clara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The idea of returning to that house, of facing the ghosts of her past, was almost unbearable. But she knew she had no choice. I'll go, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll take care of it. The conversation ended quickly after that, her mother offering no condolences, just practical details about keys and papers. Clara sat at the kitchen table long after the call ended, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, wondering how she was going to face what lay ahead. Chapter 2, The House on the Hill. The drive to the small town where her grandmother had lived felt like a journey back in time. The further Clara drove, the more the landscape seemed to shift, the modern world giving way to something older, more forgotten. By the time she reached the town limits, the mist had thickened, clinging to the streets like a living thing. The house loomed at the end of a long, winding road, its Victorian spires piercing the gray sky. Clara parked her car at the bottom of the hill and sat for a moment, staring up at the old house. It looked exactly as she remembered it, and yet somehow more sinister, as if the years of neglect had allowed something dark to take root. With a deep breath, Clara grabbed her bag and stepped out into the mist. The air was cold and damp, and she shivered as she made her way up the hill. The house seemed to watch her approach, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She found the key in her bag and hesitated before unlocking the door. As soon as she stepped inside, the smell of dust and decay hit her, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something else she couldn't quite place, something almost sweet, like rotting flowers. The hallway was dimly lit by the gray light filtering through the dirty windows. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly forms that seemed to float in the shadows. Clara dropped her bag by the door and made her way through the house, the creak of the floorboards the only sound in the oppressive silence. The memories came flooding back with each step. She could see herself as a child, running through these halls, playing hide and seek with her grandmother. But those memories were tainted now, twisted by the years of estrangement and the bitterness that had grown between them. She found herself standing in front of the door to the parlor, her hand resting on the brass handle. This was the room where her grandmother had spent most of her time in the later years, surrounded by her beloved dolls. Clara hesitated, a knot of dread forming in her stomach, before finally pushing the door open. The parlor was exactly as she remembered it, every detail preserved as if time had stopped. The dolls sat on their shelves, their glassy eyes staring out at her, their delicate porcelain faces frozen in perpetual smiles. There were dozens of them, each one unique, dressed in fine silks and lace, their hair carefully styled. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped into the room. She had never liked the dolls, even as a child. There was something about them that had always unnerved her, something too lifelike, too aware. She moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to let in more light. The room brightened slightly, but the mist outside kept it dim and shadowy. Clara turned back to the dolls, her eyes drawn to one in particular, a large, elaborately dressed figure sitting on a chair in the corner, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were watching her. She shivered and quickly turned away, not wanting to dwell on the feeling of being observed. There was work to be done, and the sooner she finished, the sooner she could leave this house and all its memories behind. But as she moved to leave the room, something caught her eye, a small, ornate key sitting on the mantelpiece. It was old, tarnished with age, but still beautiful, with intricate patterns carved into the metal. Clara picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she had seen it before. Pushing the thought aside, she slipped the key into her pocket and left the parlor, closing the door behind her. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her as she did, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Chapter 3, The Locked Room. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Clara went about the task of sorting through her grandmother's things. The house was filled with memories, each room a time capsule of a life that had ended long before her grandmother's passing. Clara found herself drawn to certain objects, a music box she remembered playing with as a child, an old photograph of her and her grandmother, a locket that had belonged to her mother. But there was one door that remained locked, one room she couldn't access. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a sturdy wooden door with no keyhole, no way to open it. Clara had tried everything, pushing, pulling, even calling a locksmith, but nothing worked. The door remained stubbornly shut, a silent guardian of whatever secrets lay behind it. The key she had found in the parlor was too small for the door, though she tried it anyway, hoping against hope that it might be the answer. But it didn't fit, and Clara was left with a growing sense of frustration and curiosity. It wasn't until she was going through her grandmother's desk that she found a clue. Hidden in a drawer, tucked away beneath old letters and receipts, was a small, leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. Clara sat down at the desk and began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The diary was filled with her grandmother's thoughts, her musings on life, love, and the dolls that had been her constant companions. But as Clara read on, the tone of the entries began to change, growing darker, more frantic. The final entry was dated just a few weeks before her grandmother's death. I can hear them at night, whispering in the dark. They're angry, so angry. I tried to help them, I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. They blame me for their suffering, for their deaths. I don't know what to do. I'm so tired, so very tired. I fear they won't let me rest. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words. She looked around the room, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty house. She flipped back through the diary, searching for any mention of the locked room, but there was nothing. Whatever secrets her grandmother had hidden away, they were locked behind that door, out of Clara's reach. She was about to close the diary when something slipped out from between the pages, a small, folded piece of paper. Clara unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. It was a note from her grandmother, written in a shaky, uneven script. Clara, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. There's something I need to tell you, something I never had the courage to say. The locked room upstairs, it's not what you think. There's something inside, something that must not be disturbed. Please, Clara, whatever you do, don't try to open it. Leave it be, for both our sakes. The words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She stared at the note, her mind racing. What was her grandmother hiding? What could be so terrible that it needed to be locked away, even after her death? But despite the warning, Clara knew she couldn't leave it alone. The mystery of the locked room gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. She had to know what was inside, no matter the cost. Chapter 4, Whispers in the Dark. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was silent, the only sound the faint creaking of the old wood as it settled in the cold night air. But Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of the locked room and the secrets it held. She tossed and turned, trying to banish the thoughts, but they kept coming back, like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. Finally, with a sigh of frustration, she threw off the covers and sat up. If she couldn't sleep, she might as well try to do something productive. Clara grabbed a flashlight from her bag and made her way down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. The door to the locked room loomed at the end of the hall, a dark, forbidding presence in the gloom. She hesitated for a moment, her grandmother's warning echoing in her mind. But curiosity got the better of her, and she reached out, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The door felt cold under her touch, as if it had absorbed the chill of the house. Taking a deep breath, Clara pressed her ear to the door, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the silence of the house. But as she stood there, straining to hear, she began to notice something, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering, like the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. Clara's heart raced as she pulled back, staring at the door. She knew she hadn't imagined it. The whispers were real, and they were coming from inside the room. Her hands trembled as she reached for the key in her pocket. It wasn't the right key, but maybe, just maybe, it could work. She slid it into the lock and turned it, holding her breath. Nothing. Clara cursed under her breath, pulling the key out and shoving it back into her pocket. She had to find another way. Maybe there was a spare key somewhere in the house, or maybe she could find a way to pick the lock. But before she could turn away, she felt something, a slight shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Clara felt a strange compulsion to stay, to keep listening. She pressed her ear to the door again, her pulse pounding in her ears. The voices were clearer now, distinct, though she couldn't make out the words. They sounded angry, desperate, like the cries of lost souls. Clara pulled back, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. She knew she should leave, get as far away from the door as possible. But something held her there, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what was happening. Without thinking, she reached out and knocked on the door, a soft, hesitant tap. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Clara held her breath, waiting, her heart hammering in her chest. And then, slowly, the door began to creak open. Chapter 5, The Doll Room. Clara stared in shock as the door slowly opened, revealing a dark, shadowy room beyond. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a cautious step forward, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The room was small, cramped, and filled with a suffocating sense of dread. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat a doll, their glassy eyes reflecting the light of the flashlight. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. It was a doll room, but not just any doll room. These were the same dolls she had seen in the parlor, the same ones her grandmother had spent so much time with. But there were more of them here, dozens more, all carefully arranged, their faces turned toward the door as if they had been waiting for her. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Clara stepped further into the room, her hands trembling as she swept the flashlight over the shelves. The dolls were all different, each one unique, with its own distinct features and expression. Some looked innocent, their faces serene and peaceful, while others seemed to hold a sinister air, their eyes narrowed, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she moved deeper into the room. There was something terribly wrong here, something that defied explanation. The dolls felt alive, as if they were watching her, judging her every move. She reached the back of the room, where a single doll sat alone on a small table. It was larger than the others, its dress more elaborate, its features more lifelike. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it, it was the same doll she had seen in the parlor, the one that had been watching her. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her as she approached, its head slightly tilted, its lips parted in a faint, knowing smile. Clara's hands shook as she reached out, touching the cool porcelain of the doll's face. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. The whispers started up again, louder this time, more frantic, like the cries of children lost in the dark. Clara stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. She had to get out, had to leave this room, this house. But as she turned to flee, something stopped her, a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. She whipped around, the flashlight beam darting across the room. For a moment, she saw nothing, just the rows of dolls staring back at her. But then, slowly, one of the dolls turned its head, its eyes locking onto hers. Clara screamed, the sound ripping from her throat as she stumbled back, the flashlight falling from her hand. She scrambled for the door, her fingers clawing at the wood as she tried to escape. But the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears, her mind, drowning out her thoughts. The dolls began to move, their heads turning, their eyes following her, their tiny hands reaching out. Clara backed into the corner, her body shaking with fear, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the dolls closing in, their presence suffocating, overwhelming. The room seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, a force that wanted to consume her, to drag her down into the depths of despair. In that moment, Clara understood. The dolls weren't just objects, they were vessels, prisons for the spirits of the children her grandmother had tried to help. They were angry, vengeful, and they blamed Clara for their suffering. She had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But the door was locked, the walls were closing in, and the dolls were relentless, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. With a burst of adrenaline, Clara threw herself at the door, pounding on it with all her strength. She screamed for help, but the only answer was the mocking laughter of the dolls, their voices mingling with the whispers, creating a cacophony of terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. Clara stood frozen, her hand still on the door, her body trembling with fear. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The dolls had returned to their original positions, their faces once again frozen in their eerie smiles. The whispers were gone, the air still and quiet. Clara took a shaky breath, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She had to leave, had to get out of this house, but something held her back, a compulsion to understand, to find the truth. The doll on the table seemed to beckon her, its eyes drawing her in. Clara hesitated, then slowly approached, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the doll's dress, and as she did, something strange happened. A memory flashed before her eyes, a vision of her grandmother, younger, sitting in this very room, surrounded by the dolls. She was crying, her face etched with sorrow, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the dolls. Clara gasped, the vision fading as quickly as it had come. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. What had she just seen? Was it a memory, a ghost of the past, or something more? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. There was something in this house, something that wanted to be discovered, and Clara knew she had to uncover it, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, she turned back to the door. This time, when she reached out, the handle turned easily, the door swinging open with a creak. Clara stepped out into the hallway, her heart still racing, her mind filled with questions. But one thing was clear, this house was not what it seemed, and neither were the dolls. There were secrets buried here, secrets that her grandmother had taken to her grave. And Clara was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. Chapter 6, Secrets in the Attic. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and relentless searching. Clara pored over every inch of the house, determined to uncover the truth about the dolls and the spirits that seemed to haunt them. She read through old letters, searched through dusty boxes in the attic, and even tried to contact the local historian to learn more about her grandmother's past. But the more she searched, the more elusive the answers became. The house seemed to resist her efforts, the shadows growing longer, the whispers more insistent. Clara began to feel like she was being watched, followed by unseen eyes, even when she was alone. The visions continued, flashes of memories that weren't her own, glimpses of her grandmother's life, of the children she had tried to help, and of the sorrow that had consumed her in the end. Clara could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the guilt and grief that had haunted her grandmother now becoming her own. One night, as she was searching through the attic, Clara came across a small, locked chest. The wood was old and worn, the metal clasp rusted and fragile. Clara's hands trembled as she picked it up, a sense of foreboding settling over her. She brought the chest down to the parlor, the room now filled with the eerie presence of the dolls. They seemed to watch her as she set the chest on the table, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Clara took a deep breath and reached for the key she had found in her grandmother's jewelry box. She slid it into the lock, her hands shaking with anticipation. The lock clicked open, and Clara hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, photographs, and a small, tattered journal. The letters were written in a neat, flowing script, the ink faded with age. Clara picked one up, her heart pounding in her chest as she began to read. The letter was addressed to her grandmother, from a woman named Evelyn. It spoke of a child, a little girl named Lily, who had died under mysterious circumstances. The letter was filled with sorrow, regret, and a sense of despair that seemed to leap off the page. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she continued to read. The letters told a story of tragedy, of children who had been taken in by her grandmother, only to die under strange and unexplained circumstances. The parents of the children had written to her grandmother, seeking answers, but it seemed that those answers had never come. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the journal, her mind reeling. She opened it to the first page, the handwriting instantly recognizable as her grandmother's. The journal was a record of her grandmother's efforts to help the children, to save them from whatever darkness had claimed them. It spoke of rituals, of ancient rites and prayers meant to protect the innocent. But it also spoke of failure, of the children who had been lost, and of the guilt that had consumed her grandmother in the end. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes as she read through the journal. Her grandmother had tried so hard, had given everything she had to help those children, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. The dolls were more than just toys, they were vessels for the spirits of the children, trapped in this house, bound to her grandmother's memory. And now, they were seeking revenge, blaming Clara for the failures of the past. Clara closed the journal, her hands trembling. She knew now what she had to do. She had to finish what her grandmother had started, to complete the ritual that would free the spirits and finally bring peace to this house. But the task ahead was daunting, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The dolls were growing more restless, their whispers louder, their presence more oppressive. The house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a force that wanted to consume her, to drag her down into the depths of despair. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the challenge ahead. She had to be strong, had to overcome her fear and face the darkness that lurked in this house. It was the only way to save herself, and to finally lay the spirits to rest. Chapter 7, The Ritual Begins. The night was cold and still, the house shrouded in darkness. Clara stood in the parlor, the journal clutched in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent the entire day preparing, gathering the items she would need for the ritual. The instructions in her grandmother's journal were clear, but the task ahead was still daunting. The parlor was dimly lit by the flickering light of a dozen candles, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The dolls were all in their places, their eyes gleaming in the firelight, their expressions frozen in time. Clara could feel their presence, a palpable energy that filled the room, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The ritual was complex, involving a series of incantations, offerings, and the drawing of protective symbols. Clara had spent hours memorizing the steps, but now that the moment had come, she felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What if she made a mistake? What if the ritual failed, and the spirits remained trapped, their anger growing stronger? Clara shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She had to believe in herself, in her ability to finish what her grandmother had started. She knelt in the center of the room, the journal open before her. The first step was to draw the protective symbols, circles and lines that would create a barrier between her and the spirits. Clara carefully followed the instructions, her hand steady as she traced the symbols on the floor with chalk. Once the symbols were complete, Clara lit the incense, the fragrant smoke curling into the air, filling the room with its soothing scent. She took a deep breath, the smell calming her nerves, helping her to focus. The next step was the incantation, a series of words in a language Clara didn't recognize. She had practiced them over and over, the unfamiliar syllables rolling off her tongue. Now, as she spoke the words aloud, the air seemed to vibrate with energy, the candles flickering as if in response. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she continued the incantation, her voice growing stronger with each word. The room seemed to come alive, the shadows dancing on the walls, the doll's eyes glinting in the dim light. When the incantation was complete, Clara reached for the offerings. Her grandmother's journal had listed several items, each one meant to represent the children's innocence, their lost potential. Clara had gathered them all, a locket, a small toy, a lock of hair. She placed the offerings in the center of the circle, her hands trembling as she arranged them. The air was thick with tension, the energy in the room building, growing more intense with each passing moment. Clara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The final step was the most difficult, the one that would require her to confront her own grief, her own guilt. The journal had instructed her to offer a piece of herself, a memory, a feeling, something deeply personal. Clara hesitated, her mind racing. What could she offer? What memory, what piece of herself could she give? She thought of her grandmother, of the pain and sorrow that had consumed her in her final years. She thought of the estrangement that had grown between them, the unresolved feelings of anger and regret. And then, it came to her. The memory of the last time she had seen her grandmother, the harsh words they had exchanged, the look of hurt in her grandmother's eyes. It was a memory that had haunted her, one that she had tried to push away, to forget. But now, she knew she had to face it, to offer it up as part of the ritual. Clara closed her eyes, focusing on the memory, letting it fill her mind. She felt a deep sense of sorrow, of regret, but also a flicker of hope, a sense of release. She spoke the final words of the ritual, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face. The room seemed to shudder, the air thick with energy. The dolls began to move, their heads turning, their eyes locking onto Clara. She could feel their anger, their pain, but also something else, a sense of longing, of desire for release. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the energy dissipated, the room falling silent. The candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Clara knelt in the center of the circle, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion. Had it worked? Had she completed the ritual, freed the spirits? Clara didn't know. The silence was oppressive, the darkness overwhelming. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the presence of the dolls still palpable in the room. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. Clara slowly stood, her legs shaking, her mind reeling. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The dolls were still there, but they seemed different, their expressions softer, less menacing. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had completed the ritual, freed the spirits from their torment. But at what cost? Clara could feel the weight of the memory she had offered, the piece of herself she had given up. It was gone, a void in her mind, a sense of loss that she couldn't quite put into words. But there was also a sense of peace, a sense of closure. The spirits were free, the house no longer haunted by the anger and pain of the past. Clara had faced her fears, confronted the darkness, and come out the other side. But she knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still more to be done, more to uncover, more to understand. The house held many secrets, and Clara was determined to uncover them all. With a deep breath, she picked up the journal, the pages now filled with the story of the ritual, the story of her grandmother's efforts to save the children. Clara knew that there was more to the story, more that she needed to understand. But for now, she had done what she needed to do. The spirits were at peace, the house quiet and still. Clara allowed herself a moment of relief, a moment to breathe, to let the weight of the past fall away. But even as she stood in the silence of the house, Clara knew that the journey was far from over. The house still held its secrets, its mysteries, and Clara was determined to uncover them all. With a final glance at the dolls, now lifeless and still, Clara turned and walked out of the room, the journal clutched in her hands. The house was quiet, the darkness no longer oppressive, but instead comforting, like a blanket of peace. Clara knew that she had faced the worst, had confronted the darkness, and come out the other side. But there was still more to do, more to uncover, and Clara was ready for whatever came next.